What can Jesus Christ mean to us today? That's the theme of our reflection. It's a very basic theme as we renew our faith, because Jesus is the revelation of God. He who sees me sees the Father. The ways of God, the good news of God's generous and loving ways, have been revealed to us in Jesus Christ, his life and his death. In him, the goodness and kindness of God our Father appeared, St. Paul says. And von Balthasar gave us those words: God's love and mercy has appeared, poured out in the world in the form of human powerlessness. That's a rather challenging expression, isn't it? We haven't thought of Jesus usually in terms of his powerlessness. We've normally thought of him, his divine greatness, his divine authority and power, as we've believed in him and venerated him, prayed to him. As we think of him in his humanity and the way in which he came among us in powerlessness, a poor man, achieved all that he did, in a certain sense a failure, yet in the end, who has succeeded as he has? There are two approaches to Jesus in the New Testament. The one that we're most familiar with begins with the divine Jesus. In St. John's Gospel, we know there are 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. John's Gospel was the last one written some time after the other 3. It begins with the divine Jesus. You might remember the words of the beginning of that Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. So John's Gospel affirms right from the beginning the divine greatness and identity of Jesus. And then tells the story of Jesus as he passes through his life and then returns to the Father. The other Gospels have a different approach. Scholars call the approach of John's Gospel an approach from above. We begin with the divine Jesus, he comes among us, and then returns to the Father. But the other Gospels are an approach from below. They begin with the man Jesus who came from Nazareth. People said, can any good come from that place with such a humble background? And this man, who was baptized by John, began to teach and preach. And people were drawn to him, fascinated, had tremendous attraction. Some people left all things to follow him. They were so fascinated by what he had to tell them and by his goodness. Somehow they were meeting God. He was clearly a prophet, was bringing life to God's people. Some people left their evening meal unprepared. They'd followed him all day and then found they were out in the countryside with nothing to eat. That story, a story from below, it begins with the man Jesus. And it follows the experience of his first followers. They followed him more and more deeply. They came to know him. They acknowledged he was the Messiah. He was the chosen one. They were sure that somehow through him all God's promises were to be fulfilled. Their faith was deepened and grew until finally in the end, in that tragic and dramatic end to his life and the aftermath of his resurrection, they came to know him as Lord. And they confessed that he was Lord and began to spread the words of faith. That approach from below, we are now coming to appreciate more. And you can see how it's a very important approach in a time of evangelization. If people are to find Christ, those who don't believe, or those who aren't quite sure how to believe, the very best way of doing that today is to follow that same journey that his first followers took and to find in the end the fullness of faith. We've been greatly helped in appreciating this second approach by the historical scholarship that has developed in the last couple of 100 years. It might surprise you when I say that historical scholarship, critical scholarship, the study of the past in a truly scientific way, has only really emerged in the last couple of 100 years. Of course, people have always had their stories, their annals, their chronicles, their memories of what's happened in the past, the battles, the kings, the great events of their past. But those stories have always been told from a very particular point of view. And often that point of view is rather biased. And to sort out what really happened is the work of critical historical scholarship. I'll give you a simple example to illustrate that. If I asked a Frenchman to tell me what he thought of Napoleon, well, he'd probably say he was a great man. He wasn't appreciated in his time. He tried to unite Europe, and if we'd allowed him to succeed, we wouldn't have all the problems of the 20th century and all the wars and battles of Europe. Ask an Englishman, you get a very different story. Both of them are telling their story from their point of view. Probably the truth is somewhere in between those two points of view. So modern scientific historical scholarship takes all that material, there's an abundant material recording the past of our human history, and sorts it all out, locates it, who was it really produced this material, where did they stand in the whole process, what was their outlook, and then comparing it with other people's outlooks, and gradually there's a far more objective and balanced point of view. So this historical scholarship was applied to the scriptures. And at first it seemed very frightening to Christians because the development of the scriptures became much clearer, much more complicated than we had thought. And it seemed at first that it might undermine faith. We've always known we have nothing to fear from the truth. And this is verified applying the scholarship. So we can apply that now to the material we have in the Gospels about Jesus. The Jesus of faith, the Jesus that we knew as we read the scriptures in an openness and wonder within our Catholic tradition, we're able to appreciate more what scholars call the Jesus of history. The facts of his life are quite clear. His basic teaching, he taught the great plan of God in the tradition of Israel. He called the people to know the God of the covenant, challenged them as to whether they were really representing the God of the covenant in their narrow legalistic point of view. He made them understand the greatness of God's plan and announced the coming of the final moment of God's plan. His way of acting was extraordinary. The way in which he mixed with disreputable people and so forth. The way in which he dealt with women in his society. He showed a freedom, something quite fresh and new. And then his fate. In the end, he was destroyed. He was unjustly executed. And after his death, those who had been completely demoralized, disappointed, suddenly were absolutely convinced that they had met him, they'd known him, he had risen, he had triumphed over death, and had inaugurated the fulfillment of God's plan. And they began to go through the world, and all the followers of Jesus took the message that God's plan had been fulfilled. So the facts are clear. Historians will all agree on those facts. But what do they mean? Only faith in the end can give us the complete and ultimate answer. The gift of the Holy Spirit, whereby we're led to recognize, as Paul said, in that life and death and resurrection, goodness and generosity and kindness of God has appeared in our midst. When we look at a modern image of Jesus, it's rather challenging, isn't it? There's an image of a Western-style man with barbed wire instead of a crown of thorns. It's presenting someone's image of Jesus in our world. We'd probably have to say that our awareness of Jesus has been captured by particular images and particular ways in which he's been presented. When I was a child, I learned to pray, "Little Jesus, meek and mild." And my mother used to teach us to say as we were going to bed. When you hear those things in early childhood, they stick with you, don't they? Jesus is meek and mild. But Jesus was extraordinarily courageous and strong personality. Think of him as meek and mild is quite misleading. And then the images that we've had, the statues, Jesus in red and white with long hair. We take it for granted that we know Jesus because we've seen him, as it were. So when we hear the Gospels, we think, well, we know Jesus, and what's Peter doing? What's Mary Magdalene doing? And so forth. But we are meant to meet Jesus in the Gospels, the real Jesus. I'll give you a couple of stories to illustrate that. Dostoevsky was a great Russian novelist, one of the greatest storytellers the world's ever known. Dostoevsky was a very devout man, a man of deep faith. After having given away the Christian faith in his early adulthood, he came back very strongly, and in his novels it's a constant theme, the whole question of faith for Russian people living in the 19th century. And he was so committed to the story of Jesus that he never went anywhere without his New Testament in his hand. And he once said, in a kind of exaggeration, if someone could prove to me Jesus was outside the truth, I think I'd go with Jesus. He can't imagine being without Jesus. He's so committed. Here, this great storyteller has read the story of Jesus in the New Testament, has been so captivated by that story that he can't imagine existing without Jesus. A similar story we have from Pasolini, the Italian filmmaker. He was a tragic figure, had left the Christian faith, become a Marxist. And once he was in a hotel room, and there was a traffic jam that made it impossible for him to move, and he spent his time reading the Bible that was in the room. So he took the Gospels, and he read the first of the Gospels in the Bible, Gospel according to Matthew. He was so captivated by the Jesus that he met, this unbeliever, this person who thought that he knew about Christian faith and had given it away, that he made a film called The Gospel According to Matthew. And in it he portrayed Jesus as intense, concerned, challenging complacency, injustice, a champion of little people and country people and so forth. Many believers were scandalized by the film because it wasn't the Jesus, that very comfortable Jesus, was the one they found in the film. And Thomas Merton, the great writer, said the scandal wasn't in the portrayal, the scandal was that these believers who said they were followers of Jesus and had heard his story countless times had not met Jesus in the way in which Pasolini had met Jesus in his reading of the gospel story. So it challenges us, as we hear the story, to meet the real Jesus and to be inspired and challenged and often puzzled, invited to go deeper and deeper, to try to understand who he was and what he was trying to tell us. As we come to understand Jesus and put him in history, understand his humanity, God did not come among us as one of us, that we may find that he was God and forget about his humanity. Clearly, his becoming one of us in his humanity is basic to the whole Christian mystery. And in his humanity, we will find our God. Our God is revealed, so we need to know that humanity. So if you have the privilege of going to Palestine, it's a wonderful experience, but it's a challenging experience, a surprising experience. In that illustration we have there, you see the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. And in that little region that's almost all contained in that picture, Jesus spent most of his ministry. If you can see a road along the edge of the lake, that's a modern road. But if you look carefully, just a little further up the hill, you see two older roads. They are Roman roads. Jesus no doubt walked along those roads. Just over the crest of the hill you can see a village, that's Magdala, where Mary Magdalene lived. Not far around, further around, not in view, are Chorazin and Bethsaida. Jesus reproaches them, remember. He reproaches them for the way in which they have not received his teaching. And as we hear that, we probably think of big towns. And they're little villages, less than 100 houses, I suppose, when you see them. And these were the places where the Son of God was carrying out his ministry, but carrying it out in a way which is remembered, which we remember, which we share in now. And then in the hills at the back, the Mount of Beatitudes. Jesus worked in that region. He would have called the fishermen on the shores of the lake there. He went up the hill and taught. We have the Sermon on the Mount, and in that same region. And it was on the shore of the lake that Peter and the others met him after the resurrection. I want now to share with you some of the insights that have come from scholars when I was teaching the theology of Christ. These are some of the authors that I quoted to help the students appreciate the remarkable Jesus that we find in the story of the Gospels. The first is from Vincent Buckley. Vincent Buckley is an Australian poet of great talent who was Professor of Literature at Melbourne. And he once wrote an article, The Strange Personality of Jesus Christ. And what he had in mind was what I've been saying. Jesus is far more extraordinary than we think. We have our tame picture of Jesus, and we tend to project that when we hear the gospel. But if we listen and really take seriously the story that we hear in the gospel, well, that is very, very challenging. And Jesus is different from what we expect. A couple of the things that he pointed out were the power of Jesus. He was powerful. The effect he had on people was extraordinary. And don't think, well, he was God, therefore that's not surprising. Remember, he'd emptied himself. The Son of God had come among us, had emptied himself, became as we all are. As far as everyone was concerned, he was just a man from Nazareth. And what good comes from Nazareth? He had no qualification, no background. He was baptized by John. Then he began to preach. And his teaching made such an impression that people followed him. So this power was his. Power was shown in his miracles. Historically, it's quite certain that Jesus worked miracles, but extraordinary events. And what's also certain is that he didn't want people to get all excited about the miracle. He wanted them to see what the miracle meant. Many times he said, don't tell anyone about it. You go off now and don't tell anyone. Why did he say that? Because he knew human nature. People would all get excited about the miracle and wouldn't grasp the point. The point was the healing of God has come. The Messianic age has come. This is a sign. Be open now in faith to what God is about to do. That was the meaning of the miracles. And he also points to the autonomy of Jesus. We're all very conscious of what other people think of us. That's human nature, isn't it? It's not easy to be human. Everything we do, we're relating to other people, their expectations, their judgments, their evaluations, and so forth. We're very, very conscious of what people think. We're other-directed, as one sociologist put it. But as Buckley says, we have nothing of that in Jesus. He's just simple, self-assured, courageous. In the end, he's up against a life and death struggle, yet he's serene, childlike, we could almost say, though it's misleading when we know the courage of the man. The next author that I'd quoted was Leonardo Boff, a South American theologian. His approach is different from Buckley's. Buckley's is pointing to what is extraordinary in Jesus. But Boff said, perhaps the most extraordinary thing about Jesus was his ordinariness. This is the way he explained that. He said, the typical experience of being human is to feel estranged and alienated. We're not at home with being ourselves. Strange, isn't it? We might have been preferred to be someone else. We're not sure if people really knew what we were like, whether they'd still be interested in us. That's self-doubt. We're estranged from ourselves. We're estranged from one another. There's nothing more precious in this life and in this world than to be loved and affirmed and esteemed by those around us. Yet, how difficult it is to be really close to one another. We're fearful, we're defensive, we don't want to let down our guard. Will they really accept us if they know what we're like? We're estranged, Buff said, from the world in which we live. To be human should be to enjoy this world. We're made to enjoy this world and all its good things. Yet somehow we seem to have spoiled that. We don't seem to have achieved that. We seem to have damaged the environment. We're not sure whether we've damaged it irreparably or not. The people that we entrust with our government, we're cynical about them, critical of them. We're not happy with them. We don't feel at ease in the world in which we live. And then ultimately, we are not at ease in our relationship with God. And we've seen that the good news is Jesus comes to tell us that we must, we should be at ease in our relationship with God's boundless goodness and love and generosity towards us. So Boff says, there's a typical human experience. We all experience that. I'm sure as I've described that, you've said, yes, that's true. That's the way we do feel. That's the way humans feel. And Boff said, Jesus had none of that estrangement. This is what he's extraordinarily ordinary. In other words, he achieves being human in the fullest sense, authentically human, without that estrangement. He shows us that it's possible to be human and not to have those experiences, and promises us in the end, he is part of the revelation of God's great plan, that we will overcome those estrangements. He's not estranged from himself. Think of some of the things he said. Heaven and earth will pass away, my words will never pass away. If one of us said that, I think we'd be taken up for treatment. But he said it serenely, confidently, in the depths of his own identity. Come to me, all you who labour and are burdened, and I will give you rest. Extraordinary words. We can't imagine what it feels like to be able to say those words in simplicity and truth. Yet Jesus said them. He's not estranged from those around him. His parables, his stories, are evidence of the way in which he looked at those around him, entered into their lives, and told the stories. His friendship was offered to all the different classes and different groups in Israel who were so antagonistic to one another. He was open to them. And notice when I speak of Israel, and I'm not talking of modern Israel, I'm talking of the Israel, the people of God of the Old Testament at the time of Jesus. Israel had different groups. All those groups formed friendships with Jesus on the part of some of their members. His friendship was open to all. We don't really appreciate very often the humour that's in the Gospels. There's a kind of ironic humour. Sometimes he teases us and teases those he's talking to as he tells his stories. He's challenging us to go beyond where we are. Imagine a camel going through the eye of a needle. Or in the Gospel story of the unjust steward, that immense debt would be like the budget of a modern nation. It was just beyond all comprehension, the debt that man was forgiven, was let off by his master. When you listen to the Gospels, don't think Jesus is always long-faced. Very often there's an ironic humour in the way in which he deals with people. But he's friendly, he's open, he's watching them, he's sympathetic to them. He's at home in his world. All his parables reflect the story of his world and nature, the things of nature. And he's at home with his Father in heaven. And it's probably that alone can explain this extraordinary self-confidence, this extraordinary courage and serenity that he maintains right to the end in his life, that he knows his relationship with his Father, That's from C.H. Dodd, the great Protestant scholar. Another theologian that I used to quote was Karl Adam, a German theologian from the period just before the Second World War. And he has a wonderful description of the teaching of Jesus. He said, "The mills of human wisdom grind slowly." And as we put together the heritage of wisdom of humanity, if someone can add something to it that will be remembered in ages to come, they have become immortal. But he said the teaching of Jesus doesn't belong to that project at all. He brings another kind of truth. It's a truth that we can't sit in judgment on. We cannot sit in judgment on what Jesus taught. We listen to it. We can never say to him, "I like what you say about that, but the other I'm not quite so sure." As we listen to what Jesus says, we are judged. The ultimate, deepest theological reason for that is he is expressing the divine truth, the ways of God. And as we know those ways, we're challenged, and we know we've come up against a measure of all truth, and of all life, and of all goodness. The next author is a man named Auerbach. He was a professor of literature who went to Turkey during the Second World War. He was a professor of literature. He wasn't a theologian. So he wrote a book in which he described the development of literature in our Western tradition. He's got a marvelous chapter in which he describes the revolution brought by the New Testament literature to our Western consciousness. He said before the New Testament was written, before Jesus, who really formed the New Testament with his teaching and his inspiration, before that, the little people of the world, the ordinary people, didn't have any part to play in history. It was presumed that history was shaped by the big people, the kings, the generals, the leaders in society. The little people were there to provide an audience so these great people could explain what they were doing. Then he said, with the New Testament, a revolution occurs. Suddenly, the little people are at the center of the stage. People like Peter. He says, what an extraordinary figure. So human, so frail, so tragic. He betrayed his master. And yet in the end he becomes the central figure of the group who tell the story of Jesus. And he says that revolutionized the consciousness of our Western society. And it was all due to the fact that Jesus had shaken the world to its foundation, these are Auerbach's words, by the message of a God who identified with the little ones of this world. As we come to realize the contribution he'd made in that, we can also acknowledge the tragedy that we've been so long to catch up with. We've slipped back for most of Christian history into the idea it was the big ones that shaped history. And now we're in the age of the common man today. We're realizing it's the ordinary people who shape history. Abraham Lincoln has a great saying, God loved little people, he made so many of them. And that's really, he was a man of a Christian, and obviously a gospel-inspired thought. God loves little people. God hears the cry of the poor. And finally, let me quote the words of Avery Dulles, a famous Jesuit theologian. And he's described the picture of Jesus that emerges from the Gospels. It's a very good summary. He says, in the Gospel portrait of Jesus, there's nothing wooden or stereotyped. It's clearly not a made-up story. If we made up a story about God coming among men, we get it all wrong. So it's spontaneous, it clearly is a recollection of people's experience of this extraordinary man. He constantly does the most unexpected things. He praises pagans and prostitutes, draws near to Samaritans and lepers. He attacks the most respected classes and insults his hosts at dinner. He rebukes the wind and the waves, but falls silent before his accusers. People would never have fabricated such a figure as their religious leader. And it's precisely for this reason that the Gospels have undying power to convert human hearts. After reading them, we can only exclaim, this spendthrift charity is truly divine. This is what God must really be. And if he were to become human, this is how he would behave. The extraordinary story, clearly not made up, not invented, but a record of an extraordinary experience, the coming of God among us, and all its unexpected characteristics. Another way in which we can appreciate Jesus is to put him into his social context. And again, these historical studies make that possible. We all know of the community of Qumran, which gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls that are so often in the news. The faith of Israel is filled with boundless expectation. And there was a sense that the crunch moment is coming very strongly there among the people. Jesus is announcing the coming of the kingdom of God. The Qumran people expected the coming of God's kingdom. So what was their reaction? They withdrew. We will be pure and ready. They formed a monastic community down near the Dead Sea. And there they lived a most strict life of observance. So they'd be absolutely pure and ready for the great conflict. There's going to be a great conflict between light and darkness. No wine, nothing like that, no pleasure, very disciplined. That wasn't Jesus' way. He shared with them this conviction the end had come, but he lived an ordinary life. He liked to party. The only thing that people could accuse him of was that he was a wine bibber and a glutton. He often sat down at table with his friends and enjoyed a party, and it's probably at table he told most of his stories. So he had a lot in common with the Qumran community, and some of his followers may well have come from there. Some think John the Baptist may have belonged to that community. And then there were the Pharisees. Jesus had a lot in common with them. They too were convinced that the Jewish people were those through whom God's great plan would be fulfilled. The tragedy was their exclusivism. The word Pharisee is associated with exclusion, separation. We will be separate. We will maintain all our traditions. We will be different from other peoples because we are God's chosen people. So this tragic misconception was targeted by Jesus. It was a popular movement of piety among the people, the Pharisee movement. Sincere, yet misguided, too narrow, giving the wrong impression altogether of God's ways. That's why Jesus is so impatient with them. And some of them also became his followers. Nicodemus came to him by night. Joseph of Arimathea. There we have two named Pharisees. And after the resurrection, many Pharisees joined the new Christian faith. And then there were the Zealots. The Zealots were the terrorists of the time. Here's another group who believed that because we're God's people, the Romans might be more powerful in arms, but we have God on our side. Let's rise up and take them on and precipitate the whole conflict that's going to take place. And Israel will be vindicated. All of them have this sense of the unfolding of God's plan, and Jesus had much in common with them. In the end, he doesn't align himself with any of those. He aligns himself with God's poor. There's a great theme of the Old Testament. God hears the cry of the poor. The society of Israel in many ways was unjust. The kings and their officials very often were cruel exploiters of the people. And the prophet spoke out against this. The Psalms keep alive that faith. So the deep faith of Israel was nurtured among those little people, those little powerless people. Mary and Jesus came from that background. He identified with them. He kept alive their hope. So in the end, he stands alone. Coming back to our autonomy, he stands alone. And here's where we see how extraordinary he is. Revolutionaries pay a pretty big price when they try to overturn a whole existing system of things. They're going to be disappointed. They have to simplify their message. They have to have slogans, have to have a program, have to have minders to pick them up and look after them when things don't go well. And they become embittered. because of the way in which people do not accept what they are offering, cannot understand, will not listen, so they become hard and embittered. And here's the contrast. In Jesus, he's not embittered, and he doesn't have any program. When he heals, it's not a program, it's just a sign of God's coming into the midst of the people, a sign of God's ways. He doesn't have any slogans. Many of his sayings we remember because they're so profound, so wise, that we can't forget them. But he didn't make them up as slogans. He didn't have any minders. He's supporting those around him. They're the ones who are frightened, and he's urging them on. He doesn't become embittered. He offers his friendship to the end to everyone. And even as he dies, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. That made such an impression on the Christians that you remember Stephen, the first martyr, said the same words, inspired by Jesus, inspired by his courage and his attitude. So Jesus died. He died for a cause. What was that cause? To understand his life and how it should challenge us and how it should invite us to faith, we should understand that cause. It was a cause of the God of the covenant. See, God had made a covenant with his people. You will be my people, I will be your God. I will be revealed to the world in our relationship. God could not express who God was in human words. Human words can never capture what God was. I am who I am. He's saying, I can't tell you who I am. I will make a covenant with you. As we live our relationship, you'll find who I am. You'll find what I'm committed to. You'll find what's dear to me. You'll find what I have in mind. That's how we come to know someone, isn't it? Knowing what's dear to them, what they have in mind, what they give themselves to. The tragedy of Israel, they had been the people of the covenant. They hadn't learned what was in the heart of God. They hadn't learned who their Father in heaven was. And Jesus is trying to call them back to that fullness of faith, because their call was for the sake of the whole world. They were to be a light to the nations. See, God's plan was not that the Jews would be the chosen race and the others would be out in the cold and come in by the back door or something to be saved. God's plan was that they'd be a light to the nations. That as a people who lived according to God's ways, their life would be so transformed that the peoples of the world would say, we'll leave our traditions and our religion. We will serve this living God who has made the Jewish people such a wonderful people, their life so generous and authentic and good. The prophets have this vision of the nations all flocking to Jerusalem. Jesus is trying to call the Jewish nation back to that destiny. They didn't hear him. And probably the reason he died, the reason he was destroyed, was that he challenged the nation's politics. He didn't die because he told the Pharisees they were hypocrites. Like, you don't kill someone for that, do you? He wasn't a threat. But he challenged what was the consensus of the nation's politics. We've seen in our own history in the 20th century, when someone challenges a vindictive and aggressive and militaristic consensus on the part of a people, they are going to suffer. They will unleash violence. They are not safe. And that's what Jesus did. Although the Jews were divided into different factions, you had the temple establishment of the priests and the old families and the money people of Israel. Then you had the Pharisees, a new popular movement. And they were bitter enemies of one another, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And then there were the Zealots who, as I said, wanted to precipitate the conflict. And they were outraged that the Pharisees and the Sadducees had reached an agreement with the Romans, were lying down and taking it. So they were divided among themselves, but they were united in a consensus that was vindictive and exclusive. Israel was God's own people, and the other nations of the world would be crushed in the end when Israel triumphed. And there was no place for anyone but the people of Israel in the final plan of God. There was one rabbi in the first century who said, no Gentile, not even one, will have any place in the kingdom of God. There you have a very extreme case of this exclusivism. Jesus is challenging that. He's calling them back to their true faith. It's astounding that they became so narrow, because it's so clear in the prophets and in the Psalms, this idea of even the greatest enemies of Israel coming to Jerusalem to find the true God. And that unleashed violence. It was for that he was destroyed. His message was, the real enemy is not the Romans. The real enemy is in our hearts. If we really became the people of God, a light to the nations, if we treated the Romans not by seeking revenge, but turned the other cheek, these sayings aren't just little moral stories about how we should behave towards people we don't like. They're statements about the situation of the time. Turn the other cheek. Walk the extra mile. If he wants your coat, give him his tunic as well. If we learn from God the generous ways that are God's ways, and truly lived as God's people, then the Romans would see that we had something to give and would be won over to the true God. So that was his project, that he win them back to finding the true God as a light to the nations. And his remedy was the law of love in general terms, which the Christians took up. Love one another. See how these Christians love one another. The first Christians really took up that message, and it did change the world. What Jesus foretold, what he advocated, really took place. The Christians converted the world, not by going out in the street corners, but just by the quality of their life. And in believing in Jesus and believing in the God of Jesus Christ, they found a way of life that converted the ancient world. In Jesus, we meet the mystery of God. Remember, we spoke of the two approaches, the approach from above, approach from below. But the approach from below can be very, very inspiring as far as our meeting with God and Jesus Christ is concerned. Because in the end, this extraordinary life, this man without compare, can only be explained in the end through his relationship with his Father and through the accepting, validating all that happened. From the depths of our broken, lost world and its darkness, he gave back into the hands of his Father his whole life. A life that was lived with us in our flesh and blood, marked by the struggle and the darkness of our condition and our experience. He gave that back as the perfect worship into the hands of his Father. And the Father accepted it. And that's the resurrection, bringing forth of the final achievement of God, the new humanity, the risen Christ. And it's all for our sake, that we may share in that risen victory of Jesus. Let me read for you some words of Walter Casper. He's now a cardinal. I had the privilege of working with him on the International Theological Commission. In his book on Christ, he speaks of the way in which we meet God's mystery in Jesus Christ. And he's speaking particularly of this approach as we come to understand the historical Jesus. Though Jesus shares our human condition, he cannot be contained within any of the frameworks available to us as we seek to understand him. We can't put him in, we can't say, well, now we'll assess you, because in the end he is the measure. Every time we're confounded. He confronts us with the ultimate mystery, which is the measure of our existence. He brings God's final word. In Jesus, we finally come face to face with God. His life is the answer to the question, who is God? What is God like? He is unique. He is and remains a mystery. He himself does little to illuminate this mystery. There's the extraordinary thing. He doesn't try to sell himself. He doesn't promote himself at all. He just simply lives out his life of relationship with his Father and calls people to share in that. He's not interested in himself at all. He is interested in only one thing, but interested in it totally, God's coming rule in love. Sebastian Moore is another theologian who speaks wonderfully of the way in which God turned what was historically a failure into the triumph of God. He tells of a convert who was converted because this person said, reading the Gospels, was challenged by the fact that Christianity puts at the center of the whole plan of God failure. And that is so human. Our experience is so much one of failure. We all fail. Every one of us fail. Every one of us in our life project are disappointed and things don't work out, and we often have setbacks and failures, often serious failures. So God turns what is a pattern of our life into his triumph, his healing, his great blessing. Let me end by reading the words of Malcolm Muggeridge. And after a long life of searching, honest and very challenging searching, he became a Catholic. And he wrote these words: "I have looked far and wide, inside and outside my own head and heart, and I have found nothing other than this man and his words which offers any answer to the dilemmas of this tragic, troubled time. If his light has gone out, then as far as I'm concerned, there is no light."